Welcome aboard the Pink Monorail podcast. My name is Noah. I am normally the host of the Street Rider podcast, where I talk about arcade games and fighting games. I'm also a huge Disney fan, and that's why I'm appearing here. The usual hosts for the Pink Monorail are Shelly and Alice. They are recording new episodes while I'm filling in for the series on Disney in China. Today, we're going to look at the parks that the Disney company was going up against in the mainland. The nation of China had their own unique collection of parks going back centuries. However, in themed entertainment, they were relatively young. As with many things in China, it did not take the nation long to get caught up and have a network of coaster parks, amusement parks, and theme parks in the various regions. Some of the parks were simple gardens, or nothing more than dressed-up carnival attractions. Then there were the mega parks that appeared and catered exclusively to the middle class. The biggest of these parks was run by Happy Valley. The company had 8 parks which appeared between 2002 and 2019. There was at least one in each major city in China, including Shanghai, Beijing, Tianjin, Nanjing, and Chengdu. Collectively, the parks covered more land than Walt Disney World. The parks were well known among coaster enthusiasts for featuring some of the best rides in the world. Each Happy Valley park was unique. They had water parks in addition to their theme parks, so that they could cater to just about every demographic year-round. Happy Valley would not enjoy its status as the premier park builder in China. The Huajiang Group sprang up seemingly overnight and had financed the Fantawild parks. They would open 12 parks between 2010 through 2015, and dozens of smaller centers in the same area. How was it able to build so many in such a short time? Well, it helped to have partners in construction, hotels, and logistics, of course. But more important was location. The parks were not in major cities, but rather on the outskirts. Towns like Guangdong, Hunan, Henan, and Shandong were big, but not major cities. Property could be purchased for a good rate, and development could be done for a lower price. They also scoured the globe looking for vendors that could not only build attractions, but could also help theme the various areas of the park. Having many smaller theme park contractors working in unison meant that they would be able to expand at a rapid pace. It was much faster than perhaps one company being responsible for the majority of the design, theming, construction, and operations of the park. Fantawild was even established with an animation studio. They would be able to create the content for their 4D movie theaters as well as films to release domestically in the theaters. They would be able to reference their own characters within the parks rather than having to license them from outside companies. Of course, to be fair, the films and characters were influenced by those featured in DreamWorks, Sony, and Pixar animated features. So why the sudden rush to build theme parks? The Chinese were very quick to adapt to trends, and when word got out that Disney and other park builders from the USA and Europe were interested in expanding overseas, they began looking to get ahead of the trend. Disney had been in negotiations with the Chinese government since Michael Eisner in the 80s, and when plans had been drafted, there were a few other companies looking to jump in as well. DreamWorks had invested $2.4 billion US in developing an entertainment center in Shanghai. Universal had invested $3.3 billion US for a park outside of Beijing, and Six Flags was building a park in Tianjin. The government had actually banned the construction of new theme parks for a period when speculators were buying up land and displacing residents with all sorts of projects. A similar thing had happened with developers buying up land to build golf courses and country clubs, betting that they could attract the newly rich in the booming economy. Of course, all of this development was also building a bubble that could pop at any moment and ruin the economy. The ban was needed so that the market could cool off a little. In 2013, the government lifted the ban, just in time for the groundbreaking of Shanghai Disneyland. In that time, the bubble began to inflate again. To see why the government had to intervene in the parks, just consider these statistics. From the Wenshang News, in 2011, China had $24 billion invested in over 2,500 parks. Of those parks, 70% lost money, 20% broke even, and 10% turned a profit. During that time, there were just over 400 theme parks in operation in the USA. When the Chinese jumped on a trend, they seemed to go all in. The USA, by comparison, seemed to open parks at a more sustainable rate. Remember that during this time, even Hong Kong Disneyland was bleeding millions of dollars until it expanded. If the government didn't step in, things could have been much worse for the economy. Despite the boom in new park construction, some of the parks already established in China were quite unique. Shenzhen, Window of the World, for example, featured scaled-down versions of global monuments. The Eiffel Tower, the New York skyline, and Great Pyramids of Egypt could all be seen in one afternoon. It was not the only park to feature smaller-scale monuments. The originator was Splendid China Folk Village. It created a 1/15 scale of China over dozens of acres. Visitors could marvel at the millions of tiny bricks that went into every replica, including the Great Wall itself. The Chinese government had sponsored a similar park in Florida with almost all the same landmarks. It was abandoned, its hotel vandalized, and many monuments were stolen from the property due to a lack of visitors. It was eventually torn down in 2013. China also featured a full-size park celebrating the various cultures that made up the nation. China Folk Culture Village in Shenzhen featured shops, restaurants, architecture, and performances from members of 56 unique Chinese ethnic groups. These were the same groups that Disney had to study and understand while drafting plans for Shanghai Disneyland. The visitors to the Hong Kong park were anticipated to be from the cities, with a greater understanding and appreciation for Western taste, whereas the Disney company planned on more rural visitors traveling to Shanghai. Hence, the Imagineers had to design a park that would not offend their sensibilities and reflected the best elements of the classic Chinese parks. With that said, the attendees still wanted high-speed attractions and a great diversity of sites for their money. Shyamlong Happy World was one such park that enjoyed a reputation like Happy Valley and Fantawild. Their animal parks and water parks were wildly popular. Their selection of coasters was well known around the world, and one of which would get mirrored in Shanghai Disneyland. But more on that later. In the early concept art of Shanghai Disneyland release, people had made out that some areas of the park seemed to be enclosed. The architectural style appeared to be French classical. If so, then the inspiration probably came from Tokyo Disneyland and several other Asian theme parks. Remember again that Shanghai was on the northern end of the monsoon belt. They wanted to make sure that stores and attractions were protected from the elements. Main Street in Tokyo had a familiar Victorian atmosphere, but unlike Disneyland or Walt Disney World in the USA, their version was enclosed by a glass canopy. The World Bazaar, as it was known overseas, protected guests from the changes in climate, including snow and rain. In South Korea, there's actually an entire theme park called Lotte World under a glass dome. In this way, patrons can enjoy their stay all year long. The glass and iron canopy in Tokyo Disneyland was modeled on the architecture used for the first World's Fair held in the USA. The buildings for the Philadelphia Centennial International Exhibition of 1876 were designed by a young German immigrant named Hermann J. Schwarzman. These enormous buildings hosted the other nations while demonstrating that the USA was an industrialized nation as well. It was doubtful that anybody today would need to learn that China was also an industrial superpower. However, a similar building would come in handy during the monsoon season in Shanghai. Theme park bloggers had been dissecting the plans and concept art for a few years now, and noticed that the park did not seem to have a Main Street USA. Instead, the buildings and streets pulled elements from commercial and historical sites like Xitiandi, Nanjing Road, and as well as Yuyuan Garden. Perhaps these were some of the things that Bob Iger had hinted at being authentically Disney and distinctly Chinese. So we're going to do a tour of the new park. We hope that your bags are packed. As soon as Shanghai Disneyland was announced, the theme park enthusiasts were interested in seeing a list of lands and attractions that were planned. Speculation ran rampant from the early concept art and even models shown off by Bob Iger during his press conference, and a model that was showing off at the D23 convention as well. Several attractions had been expected to be repeats from other parks. A carousel and Dumbo ride had been spotted in concept art and models. At least one coaster, the Snow White Mine Train ride, was being reused from Walt Disney World. A version of Toy Story Land had been approved with some changes. The Green Army Man parachute drop had been removed for obvious US Army connotations. The park also did not seem to have a frontier land or any Western-themed land. The mainland Chinese guests did not romanticize the Wild West like those in Hong Kong or Japan. Asians, especially the Japanese, had romanticized Europe and France in particular. Instead, the park seemed to be getting an extended Adventureland or pirate-themed area that had not been seen in any other park, as well as a radically designed Tomorrowland. The plans were a guarantee that the Chinese got some authentic Disney magic after all, yet Disney kept many things under wraps in 2013. There had been no word as to what other attractions had been planned. Many in the theme park community were hoping that the Disney company was going to pull out all of the stops on this resort and let their Imagineers run wild. It had been a long time since they had developed something completely original. Phantom Manor was a well-done variation on a theme despite sharing some DNA with the Haunted Mansion. Guests were hoping that Disney would continue that tradition and give visitors new coasters, dark rides, and hybrid attractions as well. Mystic Manor worked on a broad scale because it did not ham-fist Chinese culture to guests. Instead, it very subtly paralleled Albert with the Monkey King, and even featured a final scene with Wukong himself. Riders got to see folk art and musical instruments come to life from the Americas, Europe, the Mediterranean, and South Pacific. Just a few moments with the statue of the Monkey King was enough to enchant the Asian tourist. The last time the company had successfully appealed to a broad range of taste without ignoring their Asian clients was in Tokyo Disney Sea. Unlike Disney California Adventure, the second gate in Tokyo knocked expectations out of the park. Attractions like Sinbad's Storybook Voyage and Journey to the Center of the Earth were not based on Japanese culture, yet could still be held to the same standards as the best attractions that the company had ever developed. The park was partially inspired by attractions and lands that the Imagineers had designed for other locations but never got a chance to build, specifically the Disney Seas and Westcott Center that pitted the cities of Long Beach and Anaheim against each other. But I digress. The people of China were expecting something more than a copy of what Hong Kong had received. There were just over 760 miles separating Shanghai from Hong Kong, having two identical parks with identical rides, identical ride technology, and themed lands would be a slap in the face for the population. The challenge to design a resort that would appeal to the home country yet also had something unique to offer for international visitors was in the hands of the Disney company. The Japanese in particular had become big fans of the company, and many families had made it a point to visit all of the Disney resorts around the world. The distance from Tokyo to Shanghai was 1,763 miles. To put that in perspective, the distance from Disneyland to Walt Disney World was 2,500 miles. The Japanese had previously been the second highest number of Asian visitors to China, but the numbers had been steadily declining for political and environmental reasons. A new resort which offered lands and attractions that the Japanese could not find in either Tokyo Disneyland or Tokyo Disney Sea could be enough to shift the numbers. It would also aid in tourism from Europe and the Americas. In Hong Kong, there were discount passes available for people that had flown into the country for a one-day stopover. The resort could hold onto the luggage of a visitor while at the resort and then drop them off at the airport. The Shanghai International Airport was on the island of Pudong, same as the resort. It was just over a 30-minute drive away and could feature the same pass privileges for visitors. The infrastructure for having a world-class resort was being developed alongside the park itself. China had created a longer high-speed rail network than all of Europe within the past decade. The line rail between Shanghai and Beijing has at least 12 train cars, with one leaving every 5 minutes. It opened in 2011 and moves about 180 million people a year. To put that in perspective, imagine there was a plan to open a 5-hour rail line from New York to Anaheim. The Disneyland Resort would have to get a major overhaul to prepare for that. Shanghai Disneyland would have to accommodate thousands of visitors by rail on a daily basis. There were 2 subway lines which had been extended specifically for the park. These new lines stopped near the front gate as well as a freeway that had been extended directly to the property. There was a transportation hub for cars and buses as well. Feeding a steady stream of visitors into and out of the park would not be a problem. All of these people needed options once they arrived. There would be Disneytown, a huge shopping complex immediately next to the park. No admission needed in order to enjoy the mall. Think of it like downtown Disney in Anaheim. Of course, many visitors planned on staying at least a night or 2. The Disney company planned 2 unique 7-story hotels for the property. One was a modern design in the shape of 2 interconnected diamonds, which of course also looked like the lucky number 8 from above. This would be the budget-minded hotel, typically for guests with large families. The other was a more traditional property that featured more Chinese architecture. The crescent-shaped property had the high-end amenities and spas. These hotels were so large that they did not sit right on the edge of the park like the hotels in Tokyo did. Instead, the 2 were further out on the property, with roads, ferries, and rail lines that would take guests to the gate. It was similar to the logistics in the Florida Magic Kingdom park. The hotels each featured appropriate landscaping, ponds, and fountains that reflected the large bodies of water that also made up the property. There was a consistent nature theme for the overall area. It was very much unlike the layouts employed at any other Disneyland. Nature and magic were working in harmony. It was as if the Magic Kingdom and Disney's Animal Kingdom had a kid. The only similarity to the Western parks were the shops of Disneytown, similar to downtown Disney. Aside from that, there was little to remind visitors that they had seen something just like this in their home country. Planners had actually cleared some land closer to the park for an expansion. Most of the show buildings had already been set inside the park, but one particular plot of land was to the side of the parking lots and transport hub. Many in the industry speculated that a 3rd hotel would be built on that plot of land if the park generated the numbers that Disney was hoping for. Disney had gone to incredible and expensive lengths to make sure that their presence in China would be well received. From an adult perspective, the park was doing everything right. They were expanding their scope, leveraging their brand, and incorporating Chinese tastes into their attractions, stories, and themes. The company had partnered with local schools and the community to form long-term relationships in both Hong Kong and Shanghai. The entire resort atmosphere was beginning to gain momentum, with online audiences and residents as well. There was one market that Disney seemed to have the hardest time reaching. They were the ones that could ultimately determine the long-term health of the company in China. The pink monorail goes virtual on the next stop. When this series first began, I mentioned that the Disney company was having a hard time saturating China with content. Movies from the West were limited by the Chinese government, and Disney was not allowed to have a dedicated channel on television. It would be difficult for families to connect to the mascots if they had very little exposure to them. Young adults, teens, and children seemed to have very little background with the characters. The mascots in stores were cute, but so too was Hello Kitty, and a dozen other characters they could pick from. If Disney could not get the youth community interested in the parks, then they would be losing future visitors. Worse, they could be losing future employees, managers, and business partners as well. Disney needed to focus on the community, but in the process, they showed how woefully out of touch they were. As many listeners knew, there had been a tremendous generational shift in entertainment over the past 30 and 40 years. Christine Kerr, the president of the Themed Entertainment Association, TEA, said during the 2012 awards keynote that an entire generation of future Imagineers, artists, animators, programmers, and modelers had been lost to the video game industry. Only recently had they begun showing interest in themed entertainment. President Kerr and the attendees noted that there was a disconnect between the youth of today and the forms of entertainment that their parents and grandparents had enjoyed. It was true. Video games had replaced television, movies, music, and comics as the core of popular culture. Disney was keenly aware of this fact in the USA, where billions were being spent on gaming. The company had ups and downs in trying to capture the market and win over fans. The biggest console hit for the company had been Epic Mickey. The Wii exclusive sold 2.89 million copies globally. At roughly $60 a copy, that was a hefty return. Unfortunately, word of mouth and poor review scores undercut a sequel, which sold 690,000 copies globally. The crowd-platform series Disney Infinity performed better, and as of version 3.0, the game had sold over 7 million copies. This doesn't even take into consideration how much money the company has made on figures and power discs, which must be purchased separately in order to work with the game. In the mobile department, the company managed to do better. The Where's My Water series had garnered more than 250 million downloads. At 99 cents a copy, it made almost as much money as Epic Mickey had. The addition of Where's My Perry and Where's My Mickey and Where's My Water 2 kept the momentum rolling. The popularity of console, mobile, PC, and browser games was a global trend which Disney could not avoid. In Japan, Disney had a wildly popular online game called Magic Castle Online. It was built for web browsers and did not require any downloads or installations. It combined the aspects of social networking, collecting, sharing, and puzzle solving. People could sign up to play for free in a virtual magic kingdom 24 hours a day. There were shops to visit, tasks to perform, and friends to make. Various mascot characters would turn up intermittently. Players could even visit smaller lands, which had elements of real locations. The company kept visitors returning to their virtual theme park by offering seasonal events and limited collectibles. After 5 years, the company decided to make a console version of the title. My Magic Castle, My Happy Life was a Nintendo 3DS exclusive. It sold over 790,000 units in Japan since debuting. It was a strong showing for a game that was modeled after the undisputed king of life simulation games. Animal Crossing, newly for the Nintendo 3DS, had sold 3.52 million units in Japan and 4.81 million units globally in the same amount of time as My Happy Life. At about $35 a copy, that was on track to become the highest selling and most profitable title for Nintendo in 2013. I would venture to guess that Disney wanted to capture those numbers as well. In 2015, the Magic Castle game would get a sequel featuring even more Disney magic. The Chinese were fond of gaming consoles, but in 2000 there was a ban on their sale in the mainland. Those that wanted a console, like a PlayStation 3 or Xbox 360, had to visit a gray market shop. Some consoles were marketed as PCs after an unsanctioned firmware update had installed Linux on the system. The ban did not apply in Hong Kong or in nearby nations of Macau and Taiwan. Sometimes these consoles were modified illegally and came with dozens of titles pre-installed on their internal hard drive. The ban on consoles was lifted in 2013. However, many players in China still enjoyed having their consoles modified. Those that wanted to enjoy their games without raising the suspicion of local authorities had two choices. They could build a PC for gaming, or they could visit a local arcade. Arcade games were popular in China. The Taiwanese company, IGS, became very successful for developing Chinese, Korean, and English language arcade titles. After many US companies had closed down operations at the end of the 90s, the Chinese were still going strong. They had gained tremendous ground on the largest innovators in arcade technology. Japanese industry leaders like Namco Bandai and Sega suddenly found that they had competition at trade events. Unfortunately, bootleg arcade and illegal gambling machines were also popular in China. The government would put on public demonstrations when they destroyed counterfeit machines and gambling machines. Of course, for everyone they destroyed publicly, there were thousands hidden away in corner shops. Not every person in China had access to a PC. That did not stop them from gaming. In 2019, there were an estimated 586 million gamers in China. Not all of these played at home. There were internet cafes in every major market. Some were very trendy. They appeared like hotel lobbies. The air conditioning would be on full blast and pop music would play in the background as guests made themselves comfortable on recliners for countless hours of gaming. Many internet cafes were open 24 hours. Visitors could log into their account at any cafe and through the portal of a popular massively multiplayer online MMO game continue their adventure. Gaming was a huge market in China. It made almost $25 billion in 2018. Of the millions of players, the majority wanted to play online. The demographic then broke down into different interests. Many wanted to make new friends, followed by those that were hunting for special items, accomplishing missions, competing against other players, and lastly, to master the game. Chinese gamers expected expansions and upgrades for the most popular MMOs to happen on a much faster timetable than players in the US. they could expect to see updates every 2 months instead of every 4 to 6 months as in the USA. PC gaming had been big business in the West as well. The biggest selling titles helped turn publishers into multi-billion-dollar juggernauts. At the top was The Sims 2 by Electronic Arts. It sold 20 million copies, and the original sold 16 million. The highly anticipated Activision Blizzard title Diablo 3 sold 12 million copies. The publisher was better known for the World of Warcraft, which had 20 million subscribers over the life of the MMO, not necessarily all playing at the same time. South Korea had exploded on the PC gaming front at a pace even faster than the Chinese. Publisher NCSoft had broken records with Guild Wars 2. It had sold 3.5 million copies faster than any MMO in history. The secret to their success was in offering free online subscriptions to those that had purchased the game. By comparison, World of Warcraft and the other titles from the US often charge players a monthly fee on top of the price of the game. NCSoft and other South Korean developers were trying to crack the Chinese MMO market as well. Disney was as well. Unfortunately, their first title fell flat with audiences. Magic Board Online was developed by Chinese publishing giant Shanda. The founder of the company, Chen Tianjiao, was a self-made billionaire and one of the richest people in China and the world. He was young, intelligent, a brilliant business strategist, but also very controlling. He had taken the concept of Guanxi to the extreme. He expected his circle of trusted associates to be completely loyal to him. If his executives could not convince him of their loyalty, they would resign. He seemed to turn a deaf ear to their ideas otherwise. He had diversified his companies and turned many of them into stock market darlings. Yet with his earnings, he began acquiring companies and then began consolidating. His long-term goal was to buy out his investors and turn Shanda back into a private company. He was modeling his media empire after Disney and wanted to surpass the company in his lifetime. At barely 40 years old, he had a hand in publishing, gaming, movies, music, television, and web content as well. Shanda was unlike the Disney company in that they published a string of MMO hits. After all, they knew their audience better than any Western company. When Disney entered China, they had Shanda develop a family-friendly MMO featuring the Disney mascots. Magic Board Online was a very average racing game. Players skated around colorful towns on hoverboards. They barely learned anything about the icons or cartoons in the game. Players did not turn up in the numbers that Disney had anticipated. The Disney company had underestimated their audience, just as they did in Hong Kong. Yet, unlike Hong Kong Disneyland, they did not redouble their efforts or investments in the gaming market in China. Instead, they simply let Magic Board Online slip away quietly and pushed the Flash games on their website, which were adapted from the same games featured in other countries. Of course, the link from the main Disney China website to the Flash games was dead and had been for some time, showing that Disney did not put much stock on the online gaming scene overseas. The Chinese had become very accustomed to the complexity in their online games. Just about every successful genre had an online equivalent. Two of the hottest PC titles could not have been more different. Blade and Soul Online was an MMO that had character designs, a magic system, and locations that were heavily Chinese influenced, whereas Xuan Dao Jiwang, aka the King of Combat, was modeled after the biggest Japanese fighting games. Racing, role-playing, fighting, action, adventure, and arcade titles could each have a hit in China if done right, and then supported by the publisher with updates. Audiences were eager for player versus player options on their online experience, which Magic Board did have, but they also wanted the game to play great and get updates often. Magic Board did not control well and remained relatively unchanged for months after it debuted. Players lost interest in it, and by extension, in the Disney brand quickly. Disney had made tremendous strides towards recapturing the theme park audience that was slipping from them when Hong Kong was plussed with 3 new lands, including an expanded Fantasyland. Unfortunately, their extreme focus on the parks had meant that the video game crowd was completely overlooked. Plans for successors to Magic Board Online, partnerships with new Chinese or even Taiwanese game developers had not been announced by the company and probably never would. Ignoring the gaming market in China would cost Disney in the long run. Many other channels of distribution were limited by the government, but gaming was the one place where Disney could really connect with their audience. Some of the best received attractions in the past decade had a decidedly gaming-inspired feel to them. Buzz Lightyear's Astro Blasters and Toy Story Midway Mania would go over well with the arcade-savvy audience, provided of course that Disney could convince them to visit the parks. At the 2015 D23 convention in Anaheim, California, it was revealed that a version of the Buzz Lightyear attraction was planned for Shanghai. It would feature a new mission, new ride vehicles, and even new blasters. It would be completely different than the versions in Japan, the USA, or Paris. Hopefully there were some plans for the next generation of arcade titles to be featured in Shanghai Disneyland as well. Perhaps at some sort of Starcade in Tomorrowland, or even a Penny Arcade in Disneytown was in the works. I'm sure if the company in general realized it, but arcade gaming had come a long way since the era imitated in Fix-It Felix Jr. One of the popular games in Japan that was getting location tested in the USA was a puzzle game based on Tsum Tsum, another crossover toy hit from Japan. The game was free to play on mobile devices, and microtransactions allowed players to purchase additional power-ups. Like many successful puzzle games, it was very easy to get into and difficult to put down. Gamers in the arcade were able to play the title on enormous touchscreens and even get rewarded with a small plastic Tsum Tsum toy for a high score. This was only one type of Disney arcade hit that could get the Chinese audiences to support the brand. In the summer of 2015, Bandai Namco had released Star Wars Battle Pod. It was a flight simulator type arcade game built on more than 20 years worth of innovation in that specific genre from the Japanese publisher. Unlike traditional arcade games, where players stood in front of a monitor and were surrounded by ambient noise from other cabinets, in this case the player was completely enclosed in a forward-facing dome. The field of view was completely engaged and outside noise was blocked as well. The player was immersed in the world of Star Wars, and for the first time in a generation could say that they knew what it was like to pilot the legendary X-Wing as well as Darth Vader's TIE Fighter. Disney took a page from the Bandai Namco playbook. The attraction Star Wars Millennium Falcon Smuggler's Run was a motion simulator with some interactive elements. The attraction gave audiences the feeling of piloting the famous spaceship. This ride was exclusive to Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, a new land that debuted in Disneyland and in Disney's Hollywood studios in 2019. These types of experiences would help garner the interest of Chinese audiences. Youth culture was more than video games, music, or movies. Artistic trendsetters spoke volumes for an entire generation. Disney was slow in spotting these trendsetters and even slower in reaching out to them. The most influential Chinese artist caused global change, and Disney had completely missed it until fans began speaking with their wallets. In the next stop, the Pink Monorail returns to Hong Kong to find out where the modern toy movement came from. Trends were difficult to spot and even more difficult to predict. The problem for Disney historically was the size of the company. They were so large and broken up into so many divisions that did not communicate with each other that they took a long time to react to changes in culture. They responded with the speed of an oil supertanker. They required miles to change course. There was an internal bureaucracy and division of departments that prevented some areas of the company from collaborating, exchanging ideas, or changing with the trends. If an artist or musician were an underground sensation and primed for going mainstream, then the company expected Disney Records or Disney Television to be prepared to scoop up this talent and get them the exposure that they deserved. But what if the only people that knew about the next big thing worked in guest services in a Disney hotel? There was no way they could give the company a heads up as to who the people on the ground were really into. The chain of command would stop with their supervisor or manager, and those people had no contact with the other divisions of the company. Perhaps an executive would learn about the next big thing from their child, and then push the company to go in that direction. With this type of organization, Disney could only react to the trends, rather than shape. It was actually possible to work backwards from a popular trend to find out where Disney had missed a very important movement. The company had spent over $100 million in developing Disney Infinity. They were betting that the studio could build a platform that could compete with and beat the hugely successful Skylanders series from Activision Blizzard. The Skylanders franchise had earned the publisher over $500 million in sales. After more than a month in the stores, analysts were predicting that Disney Infinity had equaled the success of Skylanders Giants. Holiday 2013 and 14 were very good to Disney, and 2015 showed no sign of slowing. Disney Interactive had plans to release a new pack of characters in a few months in order to keep sales rolling and keep audiences engaged. Part of the success of the series had been in the highly stylized and quite collectible figures. The sharp angles and bold shapes had been trending for many years. It was starting to become an aesthetic used by designers in many fields, including game development, animation, and toy design. The Captain Barbossa figure, for example, had roughly the same proportions that the maquette from Slideshow Collectibles had developed a few years prior. Those proportions had become popular in animation and toy design. Sculptors like Vin Tang and character designers like Thomas N. Perkins and Jeff Mitsuda were some of the artists that helped shape animation and toy design for more than a decade. The projects they worked on read like a who's who of popular commodities. In some capacity, those artists had worked on the animated shows or toy lines for the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Ben 10, Green Lantern, Batman, Wolverine, the X-Men, and the Hulk. Each of those properties had figures that were done in the style of Barbossa, but many were even older than that. The proportions and aesthetics used in character design today were considered too extreme a few years ago. However, little by little, exposure to new ideas in character art and design began to win over audiences. For example, it was possible to buy a Mickey Mouse figure in any range of styles, from the extremely blocky to the overly plump and even classic pie-eye design. There was a version of the mouse that some collector could identify with. The thing that all of these figures had in common were that they were often made of soft plastic or vinyl. The other thing these figures had in common were that they were made in limited numbers. The exclusivity of these figures made collectors take a closer look at them. It opened the consumer up to original interpretations, original designs, and unique aesthetics. A decade or more ago, it would have been difficult to get a license for a Mickey Mouse figure that was not exactly on model. Now, artists that painted or sculpted an original Mickey could get paid thousands of dollars by collectors. On the far end, Funko had a popular series called Pop Vinyl, which featured licensed characters with huge squared heads on tiny bodies. They did not have the proportions laid out by the style sheet from the licensors, yet the colors and shapes were easy enough for any buyer to identify. Disney produced their own line of collectible vinyl figures called Vinylmation. They were more reserved than the Funko sculpts, yet without the exact cartoon proportions. Each of the Vinylmation figures had the same body shape, but with a unique paint job that celebrated a mascot character, theme park, or anything else the artist could think of. Some vinyl manufacturers, like MindStyle, worked on accurate reproductions of a model or went completely wild with the design, depending on the client needs. These three examples showed how broad the vinyl figure movement had gone. These were not all toys for kids, but instead for collectors of every age. The exaggerated figures that were popular collectibles today had gone through a long journey before they hit the mainstream. Street artists and underground artists had picked up on a trend years before the first Vinylmation figure was produced. Disney had connections to some in the underground art community through partnerships like Block 28. The collection of artists produced their take on Disney mascots in the format that they chose. Some spray-painted graffiti murals, others painted guitars or created intricate jewelry with a familiar shape or symbol that captured the spirit of a character. Some of the artists worked in vinyl because that was becoming an emerging format. The pop vinyl pieces were absolutely tame in comparison to what street artists were doing with the likeness of Mickey Mouse. Some of the figures looked proportionally similar to the classic mouse, with only a bit of attitude showing on the sculpt. Some were angular and sharp, while some looked like Mickey had melted into a Salvador Dali painting. Some artists reduced the icon to only a few shapes and colors that could still be identified by audiences. The white gloves, the yellow shoes, and red shorts could have only belonged to one character after all. Yet even the street artists were like Disney in that they were reacting to a trend as well. These artists were able to move quickly once they saw what was happening in the community. Figure art had started in Asia. Those that had been following its evolution could trace it back to Hong Kong, where one artist could be considered the founder of the art toy or urban vinyl movement. The pink monorail will make a stop in Hong Kong and visit with the artist that revolutionized the art world. Make sure your bags are packed for this trip. In the mid-90s, artist Michael Lau had started as a designer for department store display cases and later moved on to design work for Ace Touch magazine. He would produce figures for his comics called The Gardeners and combine them with illustrations. He would sometimes create figures for his friends and help design album cover art for them as well. He was an accomplished painter and photographer, as well as a sculptor. His friends said that his figures were so unique that he should sell them. He took up their advice and created a series of 12-inch figures based on his gardeners and sold them at the Hong Kong Toy Fair. Each figure was hand-painted and included handmade clothing, sneakers, stickers, and even a skateboard or other accessory. Even the boxes that they were presented in were handmade. A number was cut out in clear plastic on the front of the box so that collectors could see which number they had purchased. Lau had made less than a dozen of each of his first 5 gardeners. Even at a few $100s US, they sold out quickly. The buzz around his handmade figures was so strong that it caught the attention of the Hong Kong Art Center. They asked Michael, who had already won several awards as an up-and-coming artist, if he could put on an exhibition of his gardener figures. He presented his original 99 figures at the gallery, much to the delight of patrons. The gallery asked if Michael could create something that visitors could purchase during the exhibition. Instead of selling a print of his work, he designed a figure that was 6 inches tall, half the size of the actual gardeners. Yet instead of simply keeping the same proportions and just scaling the figure down, he changed the shape entirely. Tattoo was the first figure to undergo the transformation. He got a larger head and eggplant-shaped body with larger hands and feet. Yet all of the details of the original figure were preserved as well. The color of the shorts and sneakers, the placement of his tattoos, and even metal earrings were all on the smaller figure as well. The proportions that would be used by other figure artists over the next decade had been created by Lau. These toy designers also kept the vinyl format because it was so easy to work with and paint. The first exhibition was a success, and Lau was invited to put on 3 more exhibitions in Japan. He created a new sculpt for Tattoo and added his friend Brian as well into the new soft vinyl format. The run of figures had grown to 5,000, available in either a regular colored version or a black and white, what he called lazy version. They sold out quickly. The exhibition was all the buzz in Japan. Promotional material was created for Sony by Lau. Vusic, a sort of MTV cable channel in Japan, was the main sponsor for the Gardener Tour. Vusic was owned by Sony and helped introduce the Japanese to the global trendsetters. The Disney Channel, by comparison, did not have that type of influence in Japan or the USA. Instead, they capitalized on a teen and tween demographic with formulaic shows that featured kids and singers getting into wacky situations. Lau had caught the eye of the international art community because his format was completely new and fresh. Artists had been painting and customizing toys for decades. What Lau did was a little bit different. He was not doing an homage to the toy industry. Instead, he presented his friends and influences in his favorite format. The gardeners connected with audiences because they often reminded them of someone they knew, or even of themselves. They were not superheroes or mascots for any other company. They were not selling a product or a brand either. The gardeners were a 3-dimensional snapshot of street culture. They wore the right clothes, the right sneakers, rode the right bikes or skateboards. Lau had gone into an insane amount of detail of recreating all of these things in his model shop. The gardeners represented what was relevant within the youth culture. They said much more about what was happening in the culture than any painting or photograph ever could. Patrons that visited the galleries found themselves going around and around the figures in their glass display cases. They could get lost in the details that Lau had put into them. Each character came from somewhere. They told a story, they had friends, they had struggles, and yet they all kept pushing forward. With each successive exhibition, Lau began to expand the lineup of gardeners that he had created. For his growing fan base, he also began producing other figures in the smaller format. Suddenly, the high-end street fashion boutiques in the USA and Europe were competing with Japan to try and carry releases of new mini gardeners. Since Lau only produced them in runs of 5,000 or less, then each release was highly sought after. Shops had to carry a selection to show that they were watching the trends as well. Each figure would come with optional hands or shoes for different poses. The stylization of his smaller figures influenced toy design the world over. The DNA of the Disney Infinity figures could be found in these boutiques and these types of figures. Over the new millennium, fashion labels had sought Michael Lau to collaborate on different projects. He had worked with watch and jewelry designers as well as popular music groups on a variety of products and promotions. In some cases, his releases were run in numbers less than 300 items. For these, people would fly in from all over Asia and line up at his studio gallery days ahead of each release. He had become a master of self-promotion and teased his fans with cryptic messages and posters ahead of time. Speculation within the collector community ran rampant. Everything the man touched seemed to turn to gold. Of course, in China, the artisan was almost at the bottom of the social hierarchy. His success was due to grassroots support. People were reacting to something created in China by a Chinese that reflected what was happening on the streets of China. But because he was not high up on the social ladder, those that owned the television networks and press houses tended to ignore him. The big companies in the West, however, finally started paying attention. Nike was one of the first and biggest clients from the West. They sponsored several of his gallery shows and collaborated with him on limited edition sneaker releases. It was rumored that Phil Knight, the co-founder and former CEO of Nike, liked the 12-inch Gardner figure so much that he offered to buy some from Lau. Michael refused to sell. He said that they were not toys. They were like his kids, and he could not bear to part with them. This might be the first time that someone said no to the billionaire. This actually raised Lau's reputation in the art community and earned the respect of Knight and his company. When Beijing hosted the 2008 Olympics, Nike was contracted to design and produce the uniforms for their athletes. Nike asked Michael to design the uniforms and sneakers of the Chinese BMX team. To celebrate the collaboration, they produced a limited edition run of his sneakers along with a figure. These came inside of a vinyl box that was sculpted to look like it was covered in mud. The sneakers sold out from the Nike store and quickly ended up on eBay, where they could fetch thousands of dollars from eager collectors. Michael started working with Western licensors to produce work overseas as well. MindStyle contracted him to develop a figure to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Godfather film. The marionette of Don Vito Corleone holding his cat was done in the trademark Lau style. The strings and handle of the Godfather poster were actually made of wire and vinyl and supported themselves above the figure. The figure sold out quickly with every boutique that carried it. To keep collectors interested in the anniversary, he released an even rarer limited edition figure called Horsehead, which looked like the Jack Woltz character wearing striped pajamas and a dead horse's head. MindStyle had been working with the Disney license for a few years, and they decided to get the biggest artist in urban vinyl to collaborate on the Mad Hatter project. It was planned as a long-term project to get people interested in the Tim Burton version of Alice in Wonderland, both before and after it's released. Artists including Gary Baseman, Ron English, and Mike Shinoda were all asked to create a figure based on any character in the classic story. A special guest artist had also been announced, but his figure was not ready with the others due to a contractual obligation overseas. This artist had to design figures for other clients first before he could get back to MindStyle. Of course, most in the art toy collectible community had guessed already that it was Michael Lau. Lau released a version of the iconic Mad Hatter that Burton had conceived. It was done in the rough style of Lau's most recent works, but preserved the same attention to detail that his early work had. He was a fan of Disney and had always wanted to work with the company. Unfortunately, they did not seem to be willing to work with him. It was a shame considering that many in the company were fans of his. Designers, artists, and managers in different areas of the Disney company had visited the De La Barracuda Gallery in Los Angeles when Michael held his first exhibition in the USA. The 10th anniversary of the original Gardner Gala show saw Michael Lau introduce his most recent gardeners to the US before the rest of the world. He had hoped to gain attention of the industry, and to an extent he did. Celebs, musicians, artists, and the trend watchers all descended to Santa Monica to cover the show and meet the man. When one Disney executive identified herself and asked for an autograph, Lau obliged. He usually sketched out his autograph so that each fan could have a unique piece. For this person, he drew out a caricature of himself in mouse ears and oversized gloves. The message was quite clear. He was a big fan of the mouse, yet those from the company did not exactly have the authority to take this information to the top. They couldn't even seem to find the right people to let them know that the founder of an art movement was eager to work with the studio. Over the next few years, Disney was eager to introduce Vinylmation for the US fans. They also popularized street artist collaborations in the downtown Disney shops D Street, Vault 28, and the Wonderground Gallery. Disney did not acknowledge the man that helped spark a revolution in figure and art collectibles while they marketed the same culture he created. They did not even ask him to participate in any of their projects overseas. After the changes in Hong Kong Disneyland and the start of construction at Shanghai Disneyland, I contacted Lau to see if the company had approached him to work on anything for either park. He said that they had not. Having Disney ignore Michael Lau was not the biggest mistake that they had made in the country. It did, however, hurt their credibility among trendsetters. Lau's art spoke for a generation and directly to the next generation. Think of Tyrus Wong and his Sung Dynasty-influenced paintings. Mr. Wong was being used as an in-between artist when he clearly had much more talent to offer. Bambi would not have been the same without his insight. The moment Walt saw the art, he knew there was no way around it. I was not saying that Lau was the next Wong, but he was an original artist that had ideas and abilities that went well beyond street culture. When Lau talked, the youth community listened. He could have helped raise the identity of Disney to a nation. The company already had a hard time getting on television. Only 1 or 2 of their films might be selected each year to play in wide release. Their park in Hong Kong was barely turning a profit, and their video game strategy had fallen apart quickly. At this point, Disney needed some help in order to reach a younger audience in China. Of course, with that said, it might have helped them to have Michael market Disney Infinity in China. The best Disney artists had distinct voices and they all contributed to the company, cartoons, and parks. The art of Mary Blair was not like the art of Raleigh Crumb, yet without either of them, Disneyland would not have been the same. Mark Davis, Wolfgang Reitherman, and Ward Kimball were just 3 of Walt Disney's 9 old men. Each brought a unique vision with them. How different would the company have been if they did not take a chance with an artist with a unique style? What would animation have been without Tim Burton or Chris Sanders, for example? Would The Nightmare Before Christmas or Lilo and Stitch have been as memorable? Was it the hubris of the company that prevented them from reaching out to designers that were not already in Imagineering? Did they assume that the best artists in the world already worked for them? Both Pixar and Disney had great reputations for going into other countries, doing research, and studying up on a culture before working on a project set outside of the US. Saludos Amigos and the Three Caballeros would not have happened if Walt did not take a team of his artists to South and Central America to meet the people, observe the culture, listen to the music, and study the art firsthand. Experience was not always enough to elicit authenticity. Sometimes the studio had to bring in experts to collaborate with the artist. Zookeepers, tailors, anthropologists, astronauts, weaponsmiths, and military personnel had all lent their insight to the company when needed. Walt took chances on new artists, and his company could certainly stand to take some chances with new talent as well. Change was the biggest challenge facing the company. They had to adapt to a new market faster than ever before. Would they be able to keep Hong Kong residents happy and convince those in the mainland that a second destination was worth a trip? The next stop on the Pink Monorail will cover Shanghai Disneyland Resort from top to bottom. We hope your bags are packed and that your passports are stamped. All aboard! A special shout out to our sponsor, Circa 1955. Nicole is the founder of Lux Illume, a small company that makes candles, wax melts, and room sprays. She is a huge Disney fan and has a line called Circa 1955. Nicole creates scents inspired by all things Disney. This includes the parks, attractions, treats, and films. Her candles are second to none. Nicole creates each formula and batch of candles herself. For every one scent she's released, she's probably made over 200 trials just to get the smell right. Don't take my word for it. Go to circa1955.com, order a candle, and use promo code PINK15, P-I-N-K, and the number 15 to get 15% off your purchase. You're going to love it. Another shout out to Jim Hill for hosting the Pink Monorail podcast on his network. Pink Monorail features Shelley and Alice. My name is Noah, and I'm filling in for this China series. The Jim Hill Podcast Network also includes Looking at Lucasfilm with Dan Zare, The Disney Dish with Len Testa. How you doing, Len? I Want That with Shelley, Marvelous Disney with Aaron Adams, and Fine Tuning with Drew Taylor. Thanks for listening, and be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review for each podcast.